Hi guys, gnembon here and welcome to 19th episode of Fun Farms. In the previous episode we were looking at this very simple villager breeder that you can build pretty much right away when you start, and in this one we'll be looking at some more advanced designs as well as go through some more interesting villager facts. So where are we? Is there anything special about this place? Not really. I just thought I'm getting a little bit rusty on the survival aspect of the game, so I thought I'll just create a random world and just try to survive, play a little bit without regeneration, see how well I'm doing. So I spawned over there a little bit, I dig down to the mines, try to get some resources, and I thought, okay, let's do something interesting in this world. And I thought, okay, let's do the villager breeder. It's actually very easy. I found this village here in the extreme hills biome and just selected an area that's relatively flat, grab 2 villagers that were here and just start with a little crop plot of potatoes that they had in the village, and I just hid 3 doors underground like we showed in the last episode. In this case I actually used a tip one of you guys gave me. Instead of going 4 blocks down, I went 5 blocks down and I placed a block here where the plank is, so that only the top portion of the door can be registered as a village door, so we are exactly certain where the center of the village is gonna land. And by AFKing here a little bit, we got a lot of villagers right away. And as you can see, there's pretty much nothing that is required to build such a farm, just a bunch of fences to fence around the area, hose to hold the ground for them, and pretty much that's it. So the previous episode turned out to land on 1st of April, so April Fool's Day, and lots of you guys were speculating if was there anything false about it, and the truth is it wasn't, it just happened to happen on that day. However, I managed to sneak in a little false statement in the thumbnail of that video, so I said it's infinitely fast. The thing is, this kind of a breeder has this feature that new babies, they actually grow with the adults and then they breed with the adults as well, which means that the more villagers you have, technically the faster the breeder is. However, the catch is that it's not only depending on the number of villagers, but amounts of food that they can supply to themselves. So I did a small testing and figured out to supply 24 carrots, which is the required amount to breed one baby, in 10 minutes. So with the cooldown time that I just managed to calculate, we'll go back to this in a moment, we need about 70 crop plots with carrots or potatoes. And that's quite a bit, because then the breeding is limited by the number of active villagers that can breed. In this case, about 4 or 5 pairs. So yes, this concept is technically exponentially fast if you can provide enough food for them. So while we are on the topic of food facts and villagers, let's talk how they breed and how they use food for breeding. So villagers consider food in portions. Each portion is 12 carrots, 12 potatoes, or 3 bread or 9 wheat. There are also several concepts that villagers use in their breeding mechanism, so they consider themselves having enough food for breeding if they have 1 portion of food available, and they can have enough food for sharing if they have 2 portions available, and then they can share half of it to the other villagers that don't have enough food. And there's also something I have to mention right now, is that food never gets wasted in breeding. I thought at the beginning that if they use their food and they get their hearts and they breed and they fail to do so, they lost food. But no, so there always will be a baby coming out of the food. Another important thing to mention here is a quirk with villagers and how they gather food. This is a very good definition of what a quirk is. So for me, a quirk is not a bug that breaks the game or doesn't work as intended. It's an intended behavior that can cause other things to happen that were not intended. Like in this case, there is another profession of villagers that is not listed anywhere, but actually it happens, and it happens to be that every single villager has this profession, but not all of them actually utilize it, and this is a villager thief. So let me demonstrate it here on this example. So we have a cell with 3 villagers, okay, and they are within a village and they can breed, technically speaking. What I'll do, I'll just throwing them a few stacks of food, 3 stacks of bread, and at this point we may think that they have enough food for breeding. And you can see even the familiar event of throwing food from one villager to the other. The thing is that this item that I threw on the ground and the other villager that picked up all the items is throwing on the ground, he is the one that's also picking them up. Why it's so? is because villagers pick up items that are within 3 by 3 area around them. Roughly, we'll go back into details, how much is it, but all of those 3 villagers are within the same area of picking up items. Which means that if you have an item that lands on the ground and they all can pick it up, only the first one that's in the list of entities within that chunk is gonna pick up that item. And that's our villager thief. So no matter how many items I put here, as long as his inventory is not full, he will be picking up those food items and he will be preventing other villagers of picking them up. This one villager recognizes that he has all the food and no other villagers around him has food. He drops them food, but he's also the one to pick it up. And that's the problem. And if there was some other villager that would drop some food in the same area, he would also be picking it up. So I think it's a common misconception with villager breeders that if you see them throwing food at each other, it means that it's a healthy breeder and villagers are breeding and everything is fine. If you see them throwing food at each other, it means that some of them don't have food to breed and they are hungry. The problem with this kind of setup is we have to supply them with at least 16 stacks of food, because in order to give enough food for all 3 villagers to breed, you have to fill up inventory of 2 of them before the 3rd one can pick up his food. So in general, if you see items being thrown in between villagers, that's a bad sign. We can mitigate the problem of their full empty inventories and the thieves with pre-filling their inventories with garbage. They can be any items that they can pick up, like seeds or beetroots. Beetroots would work just fine. However, I wouldn't recommend using beetroots because at some point Mojang may recognize they have introduced new type of food, beets, and they forgot to add them to villager breeding, and they may add it, so this may break your contraptions. So I would recommend filling up their inventory with seeds, which means that with these 3 villagers, if I throw them 3 stacks of food, each one of them will have some food to breed. And if I throw those 3 stacks to our empty villagers, there will be a thief that will take all of it and they won't be able to breed, which we can see quickly after speeding up the game. Just a little trick for you if you have little food and you still want to have an effective and a fast breeder. One exception to this trick involves farmers, which should be actually avoided in any villager breeder. Food sharing happens only if both sides agree to the sharing, so the villager that throws food has enough of it to share, and the villager that is supposed to pick it up, regardless of the thieves around him, doesn't have enough of it to breed. And that kind of works with most villagers types, so 1 portion of food is enough for them to breed, and if they have more than 2 portions, that's more than enough for them to share. So let's look at these guys. For example, if I throw 5 carrots and I'll throw 30 to the other one, that one would share, and now the other one has 15 and the first one has 20, so they all have enough to breed, and they won't share anymore, then that's fine. The problem with farmers is that they think they have enough food if they have 2 food portions, so for example 24 carrots, but they don't have enough if they have less than 5 portions, so 60 carrots. So what would happen if, for example, have a breeder that we prime all the villagers with 7 stacks of garbage and only 1 stack of food, and we use carrots? Then other villagers will quickly start to throw their food into the farmers as long as the farmers' inventory drop below 60 carrots, which would just cause a mess and quickly shut down the breeder due to overall lack of food. Let's look at this example for a second. We have 2 farmers. If I drop them a stack of carrots, they would just quickly start throwing food to each other because both are in a state of having enough food to share, but not enough to have on their own. So unless you plan to run the breeder with full on food, no seeds, and plan to keep its stock up all the time, it doesn't matter, but in most cases using farmers can cause your breeder to stop producing babies a little sooner than it should be. A short note about mobs pickup area. All the mobs can pick up items that are within the bounding box of a mob, from their feet to their head levels exactly, and this area is expanded by 1 full block in all directions from the mob, which means that, for example, if we have a villager here scoot over to the one side of the chest, if I drop an item on the other side of the chest, it will be within the extra 1 block and he will be able to pick up these items. This is not that important in this particular moment, but it will be important later on when I'll be showing you my design for a villager breeder. Most breeders provide their food for the villagers through the sides, but in this case I will be providing it from a different perspective through their heads. Now let's talk about the villagers' breeding cycle. Villagers can breed when they are willing, and willing happens when they consume food or when they trade with players. In terms of finding the relevant villager, they always choose the closest villager, providing the village that they're in can have more kids. In order to help show what happens when they try to mate with them, I came up with this useful tool, which can be turned on by changing an option display mob AI in the carpet mod. And this will be using name tags of those entities to display what their AI is telling us. Since I'm using name tags, it's obviously vanilla compatible, but it will change all the name tags of all the entities, which means that you have to use it only when you are testing stuff up. So villagers, when they are willing to mate and village can support more kids, have 1/1500 chance of entering a love mode. A love mode is displayed above their head in form of hearts. It takes exactly 300 ticks for every villager, and if they finish their love mode with the other villager also being in a love mode, then they produce a baby. The problem is that they don't put each other in the love mode, which means that they can play this game on and on until they both do it at the same time, which you can tell there is a lot of randomness involved in it, but it will take on average about 5 minutes, but can take very long, 10-15 minutes. If a pair produces a baby, then both villagers become unwilling again and they have to consume new food to get willing again. Both villagers from the pair enter a 6000 ticks cooldown timer, which is 5 minutes. Within that time they cannot do anything in terms of breeding. And that's the secret to monogamous breeding when you put villagers into pairs. And it's not about food not being wasted, because food is only used to put them into a willing to mate mode. But the problem is that if you have another villager that tries to mate with one that's on cooldown, he won't be able to do it successfully until the other one gets out of cooldown. And if we group them in pairs, they essentially cool down at the same time. So roughly from the math here, the cycle of those villagers should be about 10-11 minutes. That's a very dynamic and random system with many degrees of freedom, so the best is to measure it via an experiment. So here is our test setup. Here's a little mock-up of the breeder that I will be talking about, that's in a moment. And we have two villagers that we'll be testing, and their entire inventory is filled with bread. They are both in the range of the village, but not part of the census of this village. So if they produce a baby, this baby will trigger the tripwire over here, which will add to the counter, which we can observe. Then the baby will be dropped to the infinity, which means that it won't affect any breeding in that village. So the setup is simple. With full villagers, we'll be essentially taking how much it takes them to produce all the villagers that they can produce. And if I flick this lever, this speeds up the game, removes that extra villager from the census, and allows these guys to breed. You can see the counter is going up, and I did this experiment a couple of times with the same pair, and it turns out that we have about 5.95 kids per hour per pair, which is roughly about 10 minutes per baby per pair. So there is no magic really to fast breeding. If we let them breed in pairs like that, there will be roughly about 6 villagers per pair. And to get more villagers in the output, we just have to have more villagers pairs. One thing to note here, because of this long cooldown of 6000 ticks that happens at the end of the breeding sequence, if we start the breeder and all the pairs gonna start breeding at the same moment, we'll observe increased output from breeder for the first 5 or 10 minutes, and then it will gradually cool down and go back to the regular level. That actually can be used if, for example, we want large number of babies on demand. We can just keep the breeder off, and then if we need the babies, we can just flick the lever and the breeder is gonna produce babies at double speed for the first couple minutes. One note about food: after breeding, we can actually notice that items in the inventory stack to 64, and bread is used by the stacks of 3, or carrots and potatoes by the stacks of 12, which means that at the end of breeding they will have some stuff in their inventory. That's why it's good practice not to mix foods in the breeder, because these villagers won't be able to breed in the future if you, for example, drop them carrots, because they won't be able to pick them up. So it's good to stick to one type of food with a breeder. And that's also the reason why you wouldn't use wheat in, for example, those breeders where villagers make their own food, because technically they will be also picking up seeds, and at some point the villager inventory will be filled with seeds and they won't be able to breed because they won't have any food to do it. So now let's talk how we can effectively cram large number of villagers for breeding in a small space. Villagers are 1.95 blocks high, so it's even less than 1 pixel short of 2 blocks height. The key is if we raise them by 1/16 of a block, for example placing them on a carpet, their head will stick slightly above the top block, which means that for our food picking abilities they can pick up their food through the top part of their heads if you, for example, drop them on this block. But since their eye level is not yet in that other block, if you, for example, put a water channel going through on the top trying to deliver them items, they won't be able to suffocate, nor they will be able to float in that water. So that's, in this case, is very convenient. We can feed them from their heads, from the top, and we can grab them kits from the bottom. So if you look at the 1x1 hole that we'll be putting those villagers in, they'll naturally fall into two types of patterns. This one where they will be both put to the side here like that. This happens like 1/20 times. It's not something that you would want to happen. In this case, you just need to nudge them or use a snowball. That's also very effective. And in this configuration, when they are in the corners, it's much more often, and most of the time you push them in the hole, they will organize themselves like that, and that's actually what we want, and that's actually very convenient. There'll also be a glass block inside their head, and the reason is twofold. First of all, if they ever would like to throw food to each other, which, as I explained, this is a bad sign, but it may happen, or throw the food to the babies, the food will be inside that block. It will try to essentially escape to the top to feed other villagers, which is fine. And the other reason would be to essentially remove those baby villagers effectively from those cells. So if we look at the villagers, we can see that they are overlapping a little bit in those cells, because villagers are 0.6 blocks wide, same as players, which means that they will be applying a little force that will essentially pull them apart and keep them in this configuration. If the breeding is successful, then a baby will spawn exactly in the middle of one of the parents, which if we look here, because now we can see the game is frozen so we can observe what's happening, it will be also clipping into the other parent as well. And that's good, because this other parent will add an extra momentum for that baby to go to the corner. And this momentum is going to be only amplified by the second parent, because now it's offset for the second parent as well if we move to the next tick. Now, eventually the baby will go to the corner, but we can see that the baby is also a little shy of 1 block tall, which means that being on a carpet, it means that it will actually clip in the top block a little bit, which if we put it into the corner, he won't be able to enter other cells that are around it with villagers, and he will have to go to one of those sides when they have those slabs over here, okay? And that's our chutes where all the baby villagers gonna go. And that makes for an extremely compact breeder cells, because we only need a 2x1 space literally for each pair of villagers. Occasionally we will need to replace one of those slabs here with ice blocks in order to push the items in the water streams around, but that's not a big deal. At least if we have one slab on one corner, then the baby will be able to escape through one of those holes. This adds a little bit of trickiness when building the breeder, because we have to first figure out the water streams, where the ice block's gonna go and so on, and then we have to pull the villagers in, and then we have to construct the water streams, but that's not big of a deal. So here's the first concept of the villager breeder I came up with, and it has a couple of unnecessary things that I removed from the final design. First is a spot in the middle for a zombie pigman. The reason for it was to scare off baby villagers so they can vacate their premises with their parents. It happens that the parents pushing in this configuration I just explained is good enough to let them out. Second thing here we can notice is food delivery using dispensers. So we have a minecart going around dispensing food to the villagers so they can pick it up through their heads. Thing is, if we drop a piece of food in the middle of the block exactly, so on top of, for example, these two guys, this piece of food will be in range of all villagers within a 3x3 crop. So all these 5 pairs of villagers, all of them will be able to pick up this piece of food. So this means that if we run a stream of water with the food going exactly in the middle of the block or slightly off, all the villagers in this 3-wide strip of blocks will be able to pick it up. Another observation I made is that this checkerboard pattern of villagers and empty slots makes a very good separation of breeding pairs, because the breeding pairs, since they collide with each other, will always be closer than any other villagers that, for example, touch through the corners, which means that those villagers will always breed with the pair that we designed. So here we have a couple of water stream options that you can use to deliver effectively food to all the villagers. As you can see, there's a different combinations of normal blocks and ice blocks in the background. This essentially shows how the water streams should be built. I even figured out how to make them 2 wide, which is not necessary because we only need a 3 wide tileable solution here. Just here need to mention that all of those water streams I'm presenting, they are working with Minecraft 1.12 and below. In 1.13 the water item mechanics is gonna change, and already changed the snapshots, and this will be changing because they're still fiddling up with the mechanics, which will then, when 1.13 is gonna come out, we'll then figure something out, but I don't think it's gonna be a big deal. Why I don't want to do it right now? Because you may be thinking the best solution would be to use waterlogged stairs as kind of a liner for the items to go in the middle, but there is a bug with waterlogged blocks right now. If you have a water source, it will push items out of the water source, but if it's a waterlogged blocked source, then it doesn't work. So that's a little bit of things that need to be ironed out before the final release, and that's why I don't want to be bothered with 1.13 water streams.
Huh?
Yeah, but in short, using these kind of water streams and ways to turn them around, we'll be able to send the items through the breeder, weaving and weaving, sending the items to every villager in the area. So in this case we've covered most of the basics of this breeder, so how to store compactly pairs of villagers, how to deliver food to them, how to remove babies. But there are a couple of things that we have to add. One of the aspects of a good villager breeder is the fact that villagers come out clean with empty inventories from the breeder. It's not that necessary really, but people like to have it. So in this case that's what happens over here, which is pretty nice. However, villagers will recognize other villagers having no inventory or being hungry within 3 blocks of range, which means that if you are collecting small villagers below, we have to drop them at least 4 blocks in order for the villagers in the pairs upstairs not to recognize those babies as needing food. Because otherwise, when they are traveling to the exit of the breeder, other pairs may actually drop food to them. So it still can happen because the babies spend a little bit of time with their parents, at least those couple ticks. So the act of dropping food can still happen, and I did test it a little bit, and I found that within a 20-hour session only half of a stack of food was dropped from my villager breeder that I was testing it on, which means that it's not a big problem at all. Still, loss can happen, it's just very, very rare. There's one more aspect with villager breeding, and that might be a problem with especially large complexes with large number of villager pairs, which is the door detection limits in the game. So villagers don't recognize doors as they wish or even do it at certain probability. So they subscribe their own position every 3 to 5 to 6 seconds for door detection, which gives on average once every 95 ticks. And the game then checks 1 villager position for doors detection per tick. The queue for these positions to check is 64 long, which means that we can have 64 villagers waiting for their position to get checked. And from the perspective of the simple queuing theory, this solution is rather pointless. The thing is, if we have less than 95 villagers, this queue would be empty or short most of the time. So let's look at this example. Villagers have 1/95 chance to submit their position for the door detection. And if we have, for example, 80 villagers, from the queuing theory, the expected length of the queue would be, so we have rho, which is lambda, divided by mu, which is arrival date and departure date, so this is 80 by 95. The expected length of the queue in the infinity, which is n, m1, is rho divided by 1 minus rho, which is 85 divided by 15, which is 5.3. So if 80 villagers loaded in the world, this queue will be only 5 villagers long, and all the villagers will have their position recognized. So what happens if you have more than 95 villagers? This queue gets infinitely long. It means that some villagers are going to be rejected, which means that if the game is going to be emptying just 1 spot from that queue per tick, this means that all those villagers will be essentially fighting for that 1 single spot. Thankfully, it's not all about villagers themselves, but their positions, so if they stay on the same block they count as one, but add a village trading center, a few iron farms, and you will be out in 100 positions already easily. That's why if you have more than 95 villagers, or let's say 100, 120, more than that, it's very hard to sustain villages for the entire world. So to mitigate this issue, if you have more than 95 villagers loaded in the world, we have to make sure that our only important villager that is detecting the doors is pretty much first on the list of entities to be processed every single tick. If he is first on this list, there will be always a spot available for them if he wishes to do so to detect the doors. The only difference in this case will be that the doors won't be detected every on average 95 ticks, but we have to add the length of the queue to that, so that's 95 plus 64, because when he adds himself to the list, it's going to take him 64 ticks to be at the beginning of this list and their position to be checked, which gives 160 ticks, which is 8 seconds, which is not a big deal because doors have a cooldown timer of about 60 seconds when they are removed from the village. So if this guy is at the beginning of this queue of villagers, these doors will be checked on average every 8 seconds, which is completely fine. So at this point we have the entire villager breeding theory covered, I think. So it's a good time to show a bunch of villager breeders that I came up with. This will be also a very good time to mention other villager breeders out there. In one of the first ones, like this classic Unarybit design, we were cramming large number of villagers in one spot, and to get them breeding we would need to let them bob up and down in water. This worked this way probably because partner selection was not fixed per breeding period, just they were breeding with whoever is closest at this point. I didn't look up 1.8 code for that, but that would explain this weird behavior and explains why these breeders broke in 1.9. Then the focus switched to single villager pairs. Some of the first breeders like that involves Ilmango's design. Ray showed them how you can place villager pairs so babies drop out of parents the moment they spawn, and Nathan and Ryan improved the design by compacting it. My design was initially based on the Minerva villager breeder, where villagers were organized in a checkerboard cube pattern and placed on fences. However, still the food delivery through the sides prevented the ultimate compactness, which is one block per villager like we have in our case. Since all the breeders based on individual villager pairs produce babies at the same rate, providing you give all the villagers all the food they need, the designs at the end doesn't matter that much. If you need a very small villager breeder, still the go-to solution seems to be the second Unarybit design, where he managed to cram very nicely 4 to 16 pairs of villagers, but expanding the design beyond that number might be problematic because of the food delivery mechanism. So in the previous video I told I'll have a breeder that can produce 5,000 babies per hour. The thing is, the design I had in mind actually produces 3,000 babies. Small calculation mistake, my bad. But this one here can theoretically produce 9,000 babies, so hopper speed, yay! So I think we should be okay, sorry for that. So this one is more of a proof of concept really. You can notice that my frames are really bad, but what's worse is the TPS on the server, which is around 6 or 7. And this is because here I squeeze within the smallest village possible, so 64 blocks across, 3,000 villagers, or 1500 villager pairs within the range of the breeder, so using our 2x1 ultra compact way of squeezing them up. So this is technically a fully functional breeder that produces 9,000 villagers per in-game hour, so 6 babies out of those 1500 villager pairs. Couple issues with this one though. The low TPS is obviously due to a high number of complex entities like villagers in this case, but it's also partially due to the potato nature of my server, which is 8 years old at this point. So all the designs I tested on the StarCraft servers run typically twice as fast as here. Also, another problem is that to feed all the villagers here we would need about 1.5 million items. So for example, with bread this gives 17 hours of constant production at this rate. With carrots is 4 times less, so about 4 hours. But as I said, it's mostly a proof of concept. I don't know if I would be able to run it at 20 TPS on current faster CPUs, but I don't know, maybe you guys can try. Also, it takes a little less than 15 minutes for a food item to go through the entire water channels here, so that's why we need actually 3 drop-off stations for the food for the villagers. But it is possible, and if you want to breed them continuously, so provide food at the same rate that they are consuming it while breeding, this would mean that you would have to have a stream of 54,000 bread per hour or over 200,000 carrots or potatoes per hour, just to sustain the amount of breeding as they have here. But I would rather consider this kind of breeders in general the same way as you would consider a car, for example. So you have a tank, you fill it up first with fuel, and then you use it as you go, or fill up the tank when it runs empty. Again, due to the thieves, you would want all villagers to have food in their inventories when the breeder is actually running. You could notice that the breeder is not working at this point, and the reason is simple. Since we have much more than 100 villagers loaded, the dude in the middle that's responsible of recognizing the doors simply cannot do it. This is one of these bring your own villager breeders because of its sheer size. The problem is that from whatever the direction we come into this area, he'll be in the middle of the line of the entities to load. So in order to keep the village running, we need to bring him here with us. So we are here far away from that big breeder, so all the villagers from that village are properly unloaded, and to get the breeder going, we will be now traveling with him to the breeder. Once all the villagers that we are leaving get unloaded, he will be essentially the first on the list of loaded entities, thus always capable of adding himself to the door detection queue. Now we have arrived at the location, the villager has recognized the village, and we can see all the hearts around us indicating that everything works just fine. We just need to remember to bring him back with us once the breeding is complete, so we can load him again next time when we want to use the breeder. So now I have just popped out to the bottom to see how our babies are doing. Obviously the game is slowed down significantly, but we can see the sheer number of baby villagers around us just popping off constantly off the parent cells. So here is a more realistic example that I would consider a very good yet still stupidly overpowered breeder. Since the previous one was struggling around 60 PS, this one should be better off as I reduced number of villagers threefold to a little over 1,500 villager pairs. This one still requires 500,000 items to fill up all the villager inventories, but now the food items can make it all the way through the breeder from one point before they despawn. This one outputs 3,000 babies per hour, so almost 1 per second, and to get it going 24/7, we will need 18,000 bread per hour or 72,000 carrots or potatoes. But again, we could just use it as we need it while keep stocking villager inventories in between breeding sessions. This one is also obviously of the bring your own villager type, as we have significantly more than 100 villagers rather than 100 available villager positions here again. So that will be in terms of all the explanations and demos. I'll now provide you with a quick tutorial how to build a small but much more practical version of this breeder. However, just a quick reminder that any breeder with paired villagers, providing you keep them all stocked with food, so without any visible food throwing, should give you the same rate, so 6 babies per villager pair. In this case, we will be building a 60 villager breeder, so 30 pairs. That will give me about, easy math, 30 times 6, so 180 babies per hour, or 3 per minute. Decent rates, and we should have no problem with door detection queue, even if we're gonna keep the babies around the breeder waiting for them to grow. Typically, if you let all the babies grow at the breeder, you should have exactly the same number of babies waiting to grow as the total number of breeding villagers, so in this case it will be 60 babies at a time. To build it, you would need to prepare an 8x12 area, and that's 6 blocks deep, for our babies collection. As we have seen, the design is fully tileable in a 2x1 column, so you can adjust the collection area to your needs easily. Also, this can be a purposely built vessel like in this case, or just a simple hole in the ground with ground level marked with the green glass blocks around here. Or even a fully underground construction, just remember to keep the proper sky access for the doors. For this size, it's sufficient to place 4 water buckets in the corners to push the babies to the middle, which conveniently leaves a 2x2 gap. Now we can build a simple snagger for food that can be occasionally thrown by parents towards the children. It's totally optional thing, but makes the design cleaner, although as I said, food sharing with babies should be minimal, and we should limit the food exchange between adults to the minimum anyways by making sure they all have enough food all the time. At the bottom we need a small baby waiting area that leads to a simple water elevator. Since babies cannot jump swim through one high air blocks in the elevator, this would make a natural waiting room for the babies to grow. It's also nice to keep the area here too wide to prevent babies from cramming too much, as we are expecting to have here 60 of them at a time when the breeder is running. We can temporarily remove one of the water sources in the elevator so we can control it with a dispenser. If you don't have a dispenser, you can always place and remove water with a water bucket yourself, but dispenser is much more convenient, of course. We'll control the water in the elevator to repopulate the breeder later on. The elevator is also not directly next to the breeder. We need to keep a safe distance of more than 3 blocks out from the breeding villagers, otherwise they may start to throw food to the villagers in the elevator, which may cause some food wastage. At this point, that's where the final elevator is gonna end, but we want to continue it to the top just temporarily, so I'm using here dirt blocks to signal it. Now we need to place a platform of blocks to place carpets on top. We can use any block that aren't 1.5 blocks high, so even cobble would do that, but I like tripwire or trapdoors for a sleek look. Now we can place carpets to place our breeding pairs on top of, and clean up all the unnecessary strings we placed. Now we can start the checkerboard pattern of slabs and full glass blocks at the ground level. We want to block every other villager hall with some full 1x1 temp blocks, as we'll be using half of the breeding cells to repopulate the breeder, otherwise we'll have problem with removing children from the breeding cells area in this temporary breeder. However, we still need to block other cells as well for water channel tests, so we can use any other temporary blocks for that. There will be a lot of temporary blocks placing here, but it's just to make the process of building this breeder a little bit easier. Now the water channel layout test, we need to do it before we placed in the villagers to know where to replace slabs with ice blocks in the way. For that we need to place water at the end of each turn and replace the first slab that is not covered by water with an ice block to continue with item movement throughout the breeder. The layout is very simple in this case, so you can just copy it without testing, but in case you want to make the breeder different size, you would want to test it yourself. At the turns, you need to add these L shapes of ice blocks to make items drift exactly to the middle, so all the villagers can snag the food from the water streams. Now all of this was just temporary, but we end up with the water stream support blocks like this one. Now we need to build another temporary platform 2 blocks above the ground to help us fill the breeder with villagers. Now we need to locate the first set of villager cells that we marked previously with leaves, remove the logs below and mark them again on the temporary platform. We also need to add a railing to our platform so villagers won't jump out, and finish up the elevator. Using a fence gate will allow us to control better villagers that enter that area. Now it's time to add a fake village in the form of 3 doors, a solid block and a sticky piston to turn the breeder on and off. It's time for one more temporary platform at the same height as the extended block from the piston, just don't block any light access to the doors with it. That's the time when we bring our 2 villagers to start the process. We give each one a 1 food portion, so 12 carrots in this case, and just wait until they make a baby. Since we have to avoid farmers in the breeding area, we need to do it until we have at least 2 non-farmers. However, even a farmer can do as a door detecting villager as well as a baby, so we can block one over here, and we can continue by putting other 2 villagers in the first cell. Now is the part that we'll be repeating for quite some time. If we have enough food to keep all the villagers full at all times, we could just drop them to the cells directly, but that would mean that we would need all inventories of the 60 villagers to be filled up with food, which is 8 double chests of stuff in this case. However, I want to limit their food inventory to 2 slots, so we would need only a little over 2 double chests of food each time we want to run the breeder. So for that I'm giving them 6 stacks of seeds and 2 carrots so they can make more villagers to add to the breeder. This food supply would give us a nice 1 hour runtime from full to empty for this breeder, producing up to 180 villagers with 2 double chests of carrots or potatoes at the start. But who would want to sort through the villagers for more than 1 hour at a time anyways? This whole process of filling up the cells will take some time as we are waiting for villagers to breed. Also, anytime we get a farmer, unfortunately we need to let it go. Slots that we have already filled with pairs of villagers we can just plug with glass blocks. We'll push them down later. When we are pushing the second villager in, you should check if they're all in the corners. Whack them with a snowball if they don't do so and you should be fine. When half of the cells is filled, we need to keep the breeder running until we have enough villagers to fill other 15 cells. And because we are disposing of farmers, we need to wait until we get, in this case, about 40 of the babies and adult villagers in the bottom area to be safe. It's because to fill the rest of the cells, we need to shut down the breeder first, because if we remove the plugs from the other cells, this may cause some babies to stay up top, and that would be very bad. With other slots enabled, we just need to fill them up like before, just with the breeder shut down. The fact that the villagers are quite peaceful and not running around like crazy is due to the fact that we are quite far off the ground, and there are only a few solid blocks in their pathfinding range, which are those here dirt blocks from our temporary platform. And this slows down their wandering significantly. If we're doing this in a cave or underground, they will be more likely to run around like crazy, which may be a little tricky to hold them in place to give them all the seeds and food we want. In case we don't have that much seeds, and for that we'll need to fill up 6 slots of their inventory, remember they can pick up to 7 different things in total, so you can always give them just one item of each type, just to prime their inventory slots. Just in case you use some other breedable food items like bread or wheat, remember not to drop them later into the breeder, otherwise this may free up some of their slots and mess up their inventories. When it's all done, we can remove the temporary elevator and redirect it to the final villager holding cell. It's time for our last temporary platform of any blocks that we can place buttons on at the same height as our railings were before. I'll be here using barrier blocks just for you guys to be able to see what I'm doing below, but dirt, cobble or anything would work just fine. Just imagine there are blocks there. Also remove all the temporary blocks below, keeping all the glass blocks to be able to push them down with pistons later. Now we cannot place any blocks within that villager area because they stick out a little bit, which prevents players from placing blocks there, so we need to use pistons. Push all the glass blocks 2 blocks down into villager cells and their heads, 3 pistons at a time, 2 blocks down with the help of some temporary blocks. Remove pistons in front of you, but you can leave pistons to the side, we will need them to push down the water stream barriers. Now place as many blocks as the villagers allow you to do so and push the remaining water barrier blocks with pistons, just 1 block down this time. Now clean up all the garbage, all the temporary blocks, restore all the water streams, and the breeder is now complete. If we are building our breeder out in the open, in the overworld, and in a biome that can rain in, we should also prevent our villagers from turning into witches by adding a rain cover of blocks just above them for up to 3 blocks out from their heads. It's here just to add extra longevity to the breeder, but if we would build it in some other place that doesn't rain, we don't even need to bother about it. A little note or correction as you wish at the end. Just notice I had entity cramming turned off for whatever reason and realized that babies may cram here in the corners of the elevator, which wouldn't be that big of an issue, but it disables breeding for a few minutes if a player is nearby. So I came up with a solution that uses the ladder exploit to quickly solve it. And you also need this glass pane so babies don't get stuck and drown. I'll make sure that in the world download you have this version over here. With the entire breeder done, that's it guys for today. Sorry for keeping you that long. It's just a lot of those small quirks and weird behaviors that villagers have. Obviously you can adjust this design to any size you want, just remember of all the game limitations in terms of door detection, food requirements or lag in general, and you should be fine. If you liked the video, don't forget to leave me a like, subscribe if you're new and drop me a comment down below if you're willing to do so. Next up will be our 20th episode of the series with the crazy fast but surprisingly simple Guardian farm, and we'll be back for one more special thing about villagers following that. So see you in the next one, bye bye!